They heard the Shermans before they saw them. The sound carried across the frozen fields of the Ardennes that morning of December 16, 1944. Not the roar of a single engine, but dozens. A mechanical thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Oberscharführer Ernst Barkmann stood in the commander's hatch of his Panther tank, scanning the tree line through his binoculars. What he saw made no sense according to everything he had been taught about American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine. There were 17 Sherman tanks advancing in a loose formation across the valley below. Behind them, through gaps in the morning fog, he could see more, and behind those, still more. His crew had destroyed 4 American tanks the previous day. The Americans, it seemed, had simply brought more to replace them. Barkmann had been fighting since the invasion of France in 1940. He had seen German armour crush opposition in Poland, outmaneuver British tanks in North Africa, and face the seemingly endless Soviet tank armies on the Eastern Front. But this was different. The Americans were not sending their best tanks. They were sending adequate tanks in quantities that defied comprehension. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His gunner, a veteran named Koch, who had survived 3 years of combat, looked up from his position at the 75mm gun. "How many do they have?" he asked. Barkmann did not answer because he did not know. Intelligence reports said the Americans had landed with hundreds of tanks in Normandy. Those reports were 6 months old. How many had been destroyed? It did not matter. There were always more. The question that would haunt German tank crews for the remainder of the war was forming in Barkmann's mind that morning, though he could not yet articulate it fully. It was not whether German tanks were superior in a one-on-one engagement. On that point, there was no debate. A Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank's gun was ineffective. The question was simpler and more terrible. What happens when quality faces overwhelming quantity? What happens when you destroy 3 enemy tanks and 5 more appear to replace them? What happens when the enemy can afford to lose tanks faster than you can afford to destroy them? The mathematics of attrition were about to teach German tank crews a lesson that no amount of training or tactical superiority could overcome. But that morning, watching the Shermans advance, Barkmann still believed that German engineering, German training, and German fighting spirit would prevail. He believed this because he had been told it was true. He believed it because every aspect of his training had reinforced it. He believed it because the alternative was unthinkable. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended, 6 weeks later, Barkmann would be one of the lucky ones. He would survive. Many of his fellow tank commanders would not. The casualty rates among German tank crews in the final year of the war would reach levels that shocked even hardened Wehrmacht officers. Survival became a matter of statistics, and the statistics were not favorable. To understand what happened to German tank crews, you must first understand what they believed about armored warfare and why they believed it. The German approach to tank design and tactical employment was not random. It was the product of careful military thinking that stretched back to the 1920s and 30s, refined through combat experience across multiple theaters, and crystallized into a doctrine that prioritized quality over quantity. The foundational principle was simple. A superior tank, properly employed, could dominate the battlefield. This was not mere propaganda. It was supported by considerable evidence from the early war years. In May 1940, German Panzer divisions had demonstrated the power of concentrated armour and combined arms tactics by defeating French and British forces that possessed more tanks and often better armoured vehicles. The difference was not in equipment, but in doctrine and execution. German tanks in 1940 were not particularly impressive machines. The Panzer III mounted a short-barreled 50mm gun. The Panzer IV had a low-velocity 75mm gun designed for infantry support. French Char B-1 tanks had thicker armour and more powerful guns. British Matilda tanks were nearly invulnerable to German anti-tank weapons of the period. Yet the Germans won decisively because they concentrated their armour, used radio communication to coordinate movements, and integrated tanks with motorized infantry, artillery, and air support. This success created a set of assumptions that would shape German tank development for the remainder of the war. The lesson the Wehrmacht drew was not that they needed more tanks, but that they needed better tanks employed more effectively. When German forces encountered Soviet 34 tanks in the summer of 1941, the response was not to simplify production and build thousands of adequate tanks. The response was to design superior tanks that could defeat the 34 in individual combat. The result was the Panther and Tiger tanks, vehicles that represented the pinnacle of German engineering, but also the fundamental strategic miscalculation that would doom German tank crews. The Panther AuSFD, introduced in 1943, weighed 45 tons and mounted a long-barreled 75mm gun with exceptional armor penetration. The Tiger I, entering service in late 1942, weighed 56 tons and carried an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. These were formidable machines. A single Tiger tank in a defensive position could dominate an entire sector, destroying enemy armor before it could effectively return fire. Panther tanks combined heavy armor with relatively high speed and excellent gun performance. In terms of one-on-one combat capability, they were superior to almost everything the Allies fielded. German tank crews were trained to maximize these advantages. They learned to fight from defensive positions where their superior range and armor could dominate. They practiced precision gunnery, taking careful aim for first-round kills. They studied Allied tank tactics and vulnerabilities. The training was extensive, often lasting months, producing crews who were technically proficient and tactically sophisticated. The problem was that this entire system, the design philosophy, the tactical doctrine, the training regime was predicated on assumptions about industrial capacity and strategic context that were fundamentally flawed. German factories could not produce Panthers and Tigers in the quantities needed. Each tank required thousands of man-hours to build, used specialized materials that were increasingly scarce, and demanded components manufactured to tight tolerances that made field maintenance difficult. While German engineers were perfecting the Panther and Tiger, American industry was doing something entirely different. The United States was not trying to build the best tank. It was building a tank that was good enough, produced in quantities that would overwhelm any opponent regardless of individual vehicle quality. The M4 Sherman medium tank was in many ways an unremarkable machine. It weighed approximately 30 tons depending on variant. It mounted a 75mm gun with modest armor penetration compared to German weapons. Its frontal armor, while sloped for improved protection, was vulnerable to German tank guns at normal combat ranges. In a direct engagement with a Panther or Tiger, the Sherman was outmatched. But the Sherman had advantages that did not appear on technical specification sheets. It was designed for mass production. The hull was welded or cast, using techniques familiar to American shipyards and steel mills. The engine was based on automotive technology, making it familiar to mechanics and enabling rapid maintenance. The tracks were made of rubber and steel, lasting longer than the all-steel tracks on German tanks. The suspension was simple and reliable. Every component was standardized, allowing parts to be interchanged between vehicles. Most importantly, the Sherman could be produced quickly. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, a purpose-built facility operated by Chrysler Corporation, could turn out hundreds of tanks per month. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced thousands more. American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Lima Locomotive Works, Pacific Car and Foundry, Pressed Steel Car Company, Pullman Standard, and Federal Machine and Welder all contributed to Sherman production. By the end of the war, American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. This number represented an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. The factories operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Workers who had been building automobiles in 1941 were building tanks by 1942. Women who had never worked in heavy industry were welding armor plate and assembling turrets. The production system extended beyond the final assembly plants. Thousands of subcontractors manufactured components. Steel mills provided armor plate, forges produced gun barrels, electronics companies built radio sets, optical companies manufactured gun sights. The entire American industrial economy was reorganized to support weapons production, and tanks were a major beneficiary of this mobilization. German factories, by comparison, produced approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The disparity was not 10-1, it was not even 20-1. When you combined all German tank production against just Sherman production, the Americans were building tanks at a rate that was difficult to comprehend from a German perspective. For a German tank commander in late 1944, this meant something very specific and very terrible. It meant that tactical victories were meaningless in strategic terms. You could destroy every American tank you encountered in a given engagement and still lose the battle because more would arrive. You could have superior equipment, better training, and more combat experience, and still face defeat because the enemy could afford losses that you could not. The psychological impact of this realization would prove as devastating as the physical casualties. The reality of what German tank crews faced becomes clear when you examine the specific circumstances of units in the field during the final year of the war. Consider the experience of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, during the Battle of the Bulge. The division began the offensive on December 16, 1944, with approximately 40 operational Panther tanks and a smaller number of Panzer IVs. These represented the cream of German armoured forces, crewed by veterans with extensive combat experience. In the first 3 days of the offensive, Leibstandarte tank crews performed exactly as their training and doctrine prescribed. They engaged American armour at long range, using superior optics and gun performance to destroy Shermans before the Americans could effectively return fire. One Tiger II from the attached heavy tank battalion destroyed 7 American tanks in a single engagement near Stavelot. The crews reported the engagements with confidence. German tanks were superior. German crews were better trained. The offensive was succeeding. Then the replacements arrived. Not German replacements, American replacements. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared. Tank crews that had successfully ambushed American columns and destroyed multiple vehicles found themselves facing fresh American armor within hours. The Americans were not retreating to regroup and rebuild their forces. They were simply bringing forward more tanks from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer battalion in the 21st Panzer Division, described the experience in his post-war memoir. His unit had destroyed an American tank company, knocking out 14 Shermans in a carefully executed ambush. The crews celebrated briefly, believing they had crippled American armor in that sector. The next morning, reconnaissance reported 30 American tanks moving up to replace the losses. Von Luck realized with cold clarity that his unit was fighting an opponent that could absorb losses indefinitely, while German losses were irreplaceable. The casualty mathematics were brutal and simple. A German Panther crew that destroyed 3 Shermans before being knocked out themselves was not achieving a favorable exchange ratio in strategic terms. Germany was producing approximately 200 Panthers per month at peak production in mid-1944. The United States was producing over 1,000 Shermans per month during the same period. Even a 5-to-1 kill ratio, which German crews occasionally achieved under ideal conditions, was strategically meaningless when the Americans could replace losses 5 times faster than the Germans could inflict them. The psychological strain of this realization manifested in different ways among German tank crews. Some maintained almost desperate faith in German superiority, clinging to the belief that individual quality would eventually prevail. Others developed a fatalistic acceptance, understanding they were doomed but determined to exact the highest possible price. Still others experienced a kind of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile their training and beliefs with the reality they observed. Tank maintenance records from German units in early 1945 reveal another dimension of the crisis. Spare parts were increasingly unavailable. A Panther that threw a track might sit immobilized for weeks waiting for replacement links. An engine failure could render a tank permanently inoperable because no replacement engines existed in the supply system. German crews were instructed to cannibalize damaged tanks for parts to keep others running. American tank crews faced no such constraints. A Sherman with mechanical problems was often simply abandoned and replaced with a fresh vehicle. Spare parts arrived in abundance. Complete replacement engines were available at forward maintenance depots. Tracks, road wheels, transmissions, gun tubes, everything was available in quantities that seemed incomprehensible to German tankers who examined captured American supply dumps. One German tank commander, captured after his Panther was disabled near Bastogne, told American interrogators that he initially believed the supplies he saw in American positions were theatrical props, a deception intended to intimidate German prisoners. He could not accept that any army would have such abundance of equipment and supplies. The interrogator walked him through an American supply depot, showing him crates of ammunition, spare tank parts, jerry cans of fuel, and rations stacked to the ceiling. The German officer's report, filed with Wehrmacht intelligence, noted that American logistics appeared to operate on principles entirely divorced from resource constraints. The collision between German tank doctrine and American material reality reached its critical point during the Normandy campaign and its aftermath. German tank crews entered the battle for France with confidence based on reasonable assumptions. Possessed superior tanks. They had extensive defensive preparations. They faced an enemy that would have to advance across difficult terrain against prepared positions. Every advantage lay with the defender. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the Normandy beaches. German tank units moved forward to contain the beachhead and drive the Allies back into the sea. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, was the first German armour to engage Allied forces. Their Panthers and Panzer IVs performed well in initial engagements, destroying numerous Allied tanks and inflicting significant casualties. But the Allied forces did not collapse. They did not retreat. The beachhead expanded. More troops came ashore, more tanks arrived, more supplies accumulated on the beaches. German tank commanders radioed increasingly desperate reports to higher headquarters. They had destroyed the reported number of enemy tanks, yet more enemy tanks appeared. They had inflicted casualty figures that should have forced enemy withdrawal. Yet the enemy continued advancing. The Allied breakout from Normandy in late July demonstrated the futility of German tactical success against overwhelming material superiority. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, committed massive American forces to break through German lines west of Saint-Lô. German tank units fought skillfully, using terrain and superior equipment to maximum advantage. They destroyed American tanks in significant numbers. The Panzer Lehr Division, defending the sector, reported destroying over 70 Allied tanks in the first 2 days of fighting. It made no difference. The Americans simply brought forward more tanks, more infantry, more artillery, and continued the offensive. Within a week, American armor had broken through into open country, and German defensive positions in Normandy collapsed. Tank units that had fought skillfully and inflicted heavy losses found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies, and forced to abandon equipment that could not be recovered or repaired. The retreat across France destroyed any remaining illusions about German material sustainability. Tank units that entered Normandy with 40 or 50 operational vehicles reached the German border with a dozen tanks or fewer. Many units lost all their armour, with crews escaping on foot or in commandeered vehicles. The Panthers and Tigers that survived combat often broke down during the retreat due to mechanical failures that could not be repaired without spare parts that did not exist. German tank production could not replace these losses. Even operating at maximum capacity with forced labour and increasingly desperate resource allocation, German factories were producing approximately 250 tanks per month total across all types. The Americans and British were landing that many tanks in France every few days. Soviet factories were producing even more, feeding the massive Eastern Front battles that consumed German armour in vast numbers. Individual German tank commanders began to understand the hopelessness of their situation. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces with over 150 confirmed tank kills, described the growing awareness among crews that they were fighting a losing battle regardless of individual tactical success. His unit, equipped with Tiger tanks, had destroyed Soviet armour in numbers that should have been decisive. But the Soviets simply brought forward more tanks. The factory output of Soviet 34 tanks alone exceeded total German tank production across all models. The experience of Oberleutnant Ernst Barkmann illustrates the psychological progression. Barkmann was an exceptional tank commander, eventually credited with over 80 tank kills. In August 1944, near the town of Le Loiret in Normandy, his single Panther tank engaged and destroyed 9 American Shermans in one engagement. It was a textbook demonstration of German tactical superiority and individual tank quality. But that evening, returning to his unit's assembly area, Barkmann encountered an American supply column that had been captured. The amount of material was staggering: trucks loaded with ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies, and fuel stretched for over a mile. His crew examined American rations and found more food in a single daily ration pack than German soldiers received in a week. They found spare tank parts in quantities, suggesting the Americans could rebuild entire tanks in the field. They found jerry cans of fuel stacked by the hundreds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Barkmann understood in that moment that tactical victories were meaningless. The Americans could afford to lose 9 tanks because they had 900 more. They could advance into artillery fire and accept casualties because replacements were endless. German forces had to husband every resource, avoid losses, and still faced inevitable defeat through attrition. By early 1945, German tank crews were operating under conditions that bore no resemblance to their training or doctrine. The fundamental assumptions underlying German armoured warfare had proven catastrophically wrong. Quality could not overcome quantity when the quantity disparity was 20-1 or greater. Superior equipment meant nothing without fuel to move it or ammunition to fire it. Tactical skill became irrelevant when strategic defeat was inevitable. The casualty statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. German tank crew casualty rates varied by theatre and period, but reliable Wehrmacht records indicate that tank crews serving in the West from D-Day through the end of the war experienced casualty rates approaching 70 to 80%. These figures included killed, wounded so severely they could not return to service, and captured. For crews serving in the final months of the war, from January through May 1945, the casualty rates were even higher. These numbers represented not just military defeat but the complete failure of a military system. German tank doctrine assumed that superior equipment and training would enable smaller forces to defeat larger ones. This assumption worked when the quality gap was substantial and the quantity gap was manageable. It failed catastrophically when facing opponents who possessed adequate quality and overwhelming quantity. The American Sherman, while inferior to German tanks in armor protection and gun performance, was adequate for its purpose. It could destroy German tanks under the right conditions, particularly when engaging from the flanks or rear, where armor was thinner. It was mechanically reliable, allowing American units to maintain higher operational rates than German forces. It was produced in quantities that made individual losses tactically irrelevant. More importantly, American doctrine did not require Shermans to defeat Panthers or Tigers in one-on-one duels. American forces used combined arms tactics, employing artillery, air support, and infantry anti-tank weapons alongside armor. When American tank units encountered superior German armor, they could call in artillery strikes or air support. They could maneuver to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. They had radio communication in every tank, enabling coordination that German forces could rarely match. The final campaigns in Germany demonstrated the complete collapse of German armoured capability. During the Ruhr encirclement in April 1945, German tank units fought with whatever fuel they had remaining until their tanks literally ran dry. Crews abandoned Panthers and Tigers that were mechanically sound but immobile due to lack of fuel. Some units dug their tanks into fixed positions, using them as stationary bunkers until ammunition was exhausted. Wehrmacht, after action reports from the final months, described tank units with 0 operational vehicles continuing to exist on paper. The crews remained organized, waiting for tanks that would never arrive. Some received bicycles and were converted to infantry. Others simply dissolved as men deserted or surrendered. The few remaining operational German tanks were concentrated in ever smaller formations, achieving local tactical successes that had no strategic impact. For the individual tank crewman, survival became a matter of increasingly desperate mathematics. Each engagement meant facing an enemy that could afford losses and would simply bring forward more tanks. Each day meant operating equipment that was wearing out without replacement parts. Each week meant reduced rations as supply lines collapsed. The psychological strain was enormous. Men who had believed in German technological and tactical superiority faced undeniable evidence that belief was wrong and that they were doomed regardless of individual skill or courage. The men who survived German tank service carried knowledge that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. Ernst Barkmann, who had destroyed over 80 Allied tanks and survived the war, spent years after 1945 trying to reconcile his tactical successes with Germany's strategic defeat. In interviews conducted decades later, he described the profound dissonance of being an expert in a field where expertise proved meaningless against material disparity. Barkmann was exceptional not just in skill but in survival. Most German tank commanders did not survive the war. The crews of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, which entered the Ardennes offensive with experienced veterans, lost over 70% of their tank personnel by war's end. Some died in combat, others were captured. Many were wounded so severely they never returned to service. The TP Division's tank strength, which peaked at over 100 vehicles in mid-1944, stood at fewer than a dozen operational tanks by April 1945. The experience of ordinary tank crewmen was even grimmer. Gunners, loaders, drivers, and radio operators received less recognition than commanders, but faced identical risks. Inside a burning tank, rank provided no protection. When a Sherman's 75mm round penetrated a Panther's side armor, everyone in the crew compartment faced the same fate. Survival rates for enlisted tank crew members were marginally lower than for officers, primarily because junior enlisted men received less training in escape procedures and situational awareness. German tank crews captured by American forces often experienced shock when they saw American rear area facilities. Prisoner of war camps had adequate food, medical facilities had supplies and equipment, recreation areas had sports equipment and musical instruments. These were not privileges extended to valued prisoners. They were simply the baseline conditions in an American military system that had abundance built into its logistics. One former Panther commander, captured near Aachen in October 1944, described his interrogation experience to German military historians in the 1980s. The American intelligence officer questioning him had been friendly, almost casual. The room had electric heating. Coffee was available. The officer asked about German tank tactics and equipment with genuine professional curiosity, taking notes in a clean notebook with a mechanical pencil. The German officer realized during this conversation that the Americans viewed the war as a professional problem to be solved efficiently, not an existential struggle requiring total sacrifice. The contrast with German conditions was profound. By late 1944, German tank crews were operating on reduced rations. Fuel allocations were calculated to the liter. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts existed only through cannibalization. Men were exhausted from continuous operations without adequate rest. The American interrogator, by contrast, appeared well-fed, rested, and unhurried. He represented a military system that could afford to treat even the process of questioning prisoners as a routine administrative task, rather than an urgent necessity. Post-war analysis by German military historians attempted to extract lessons from the tank warfare experience. The studies focused heavily on tactical and operational factors: better coordination with infantry, more effective use of terrain, improved anti-tank defenses, but the fundamental lesson was one that German officers found difficult to acknowledge explicitly. No amount of tactical excellence could overcome strategic material inferiority of the magnitude Germany faced. The casualty rates among tank crews were not primarily the result of tactical errors or inadequate training. They were the inevitable consequence of fighting an opponent with overwhelming material superiority. American post-war studies reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. The United States Army's Armored School at Fort Knox conducted extensive analysis of tank warfare in Europe. Their findings acknowledged that German tanks were generally superior in one-on-one combat. Panther and Tiger tanks could and did destroy Shermans at ranges where American guns were ineffective. But the studies concluded that this superiority was tactically relevant, but strategically meaningless. American forces could accept unfavorable loss ratios because they had the industrial capacity to sustain them. German forces could not. The human cost of this strategic calculation was rarely discussed in official studies. For American tank crews, the knowledge that they were fighting in inferior vehicles against superior opponents created its own psychological burden. Sherman crews called their tanks Ronsons, after a cigarette lighter brand, referencing how easily they burned when hit. The dark humor reflected genuine fear. But American crews also knew that if their tank was destroyed, they would likely receive a replacement vehicle within days. If they survived, they would crew another Sherman and continue fighting. The final accounting of tank production reveals the full magnitude of the disparity that doomed German tank crews. American factories produced 49,234 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945. This figure represents only medium tanks and does not include the thousands of light tanks, tank destroyers, and armored vehicles that American industry produced simultaneously. German tank production, across all types, from 1942 through 1945, totaled approximately 27,000 vehicles. This included Panzer IIs, Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tigers, and all variants. The production figures sound substantial until you compare them directly with Allied output. The Soviet Union alone produced over 60,034 tanks during the same period. Britain produced thousands of Churchill, Cromwell, and other tank types. The combined Allied tank production exceeded German output by more than 5-1. But raw production numbers tell only part of the story. American tanks reached the battlefield in fighting condition, with full ammunition loads, complete crews, and adequate logistics support. German tanks increasingly arrived at the front with incomplete equipment, inadequately trained crews, and insufficient fuel for sustained operations. The difference reflected deeper industrial and organizational capabilities. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, purpose-built for Sherman production, employed over 5,000 workers at peak production. The facility operated continuously with 3 shifts covering 24 hours. Workers had adequate food, housing, and medical care. The assembly line used modern production techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing. Quality control was rigorous. Tanks that failed inspection were fixed immediately or scrapped. The production system assumed abundance of materials and labor. German tank factories operated under fundamentally different conditions. Labor included forced workers from occupied territories who had little incentive to maintain quality. Materials were increasingly substituted with inferior alternatives as strategic resources became unavailable. Allied bombing disrupted production schedules and destroyed machine tools. Factories operated despite shortages of electricity, raw materials, and skilled workers. The production system assumed scarcity and improvisation. These differences manifested in the tanks themselves. A Sherman produced in late 1944 was mechanically identical to one produced a year earlier. Parts were interchangeable. Training materials remained current. Maintenance procedures were standardized. An American tank crew could move from one Sherman to another and find everything in the expected location operating in the expected manner. German tank production, by contrast, involved constant modification and variation. Panthers produced early in the production run had different components than later models. Parts were not always interchangeable between variants. Field modifications became standard as crews adapted tanks to specific needs. The lack of standardization created maintenance nightmares and training complications. A crew trained on one Panther variant might find a different variant, configured entirely differently. The logistics burden extended beyond initial production. Every tank required continuous support in the form of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance. American logistics provided this support with industrial efficiency. Forward supply depots maintained stocks of common replacement parts. Fuel arrived in dedicated tanker, trucks. Ammunition was available in quantities that encouraged crews to fire freely, rather than conserve rounds. Maintenance units had the tools and parts to repair most problems in the field. German logistics, by contrast, operated in a state of permanent crisis. Fuel was so scarce that tank movements were carefully calculated to minimize consumption. Ammunition was rationed, with crews instructed to make every shot count. Spare parts were scavenged from disabled vehicles. Maintenance units improvised repairs using whatever materials were available. The logistics system assumed scarcity and demanded that crews operate their equipment until it literally could not be fixed. For German tank crews, these logistics limitations were as dangerous as enemy fire. A tank that broke down during an advance might be abandoned simply because recovery vehicles and spare parts were unavailable. Crews sometimes destroyed their own mechanically sound tanks when fuel exhaustion made them immobile. The awareness that every sortie might be the last due to fuel or parts shortages created constant stress beyond the dangers of combat. The industrial truth was simple and brutal. Germany never had the productive capacity to sustain prolonged armoured warfare against the combined Allied powers. The decision to prioritize quality over quantity in tank design represented a strategic miscalculation of profound proportions. German industry could build excellent tanks in limited numbers or adequate tanks in larger quantities, but it could not match Allied production regardless of design choices. The tank crews paid the price for this strategic failure with casualty rates that reflected not their inadequacy but the impossibility of their mission. The story of German tank crews in World War II is not primarily a story of tactical failure. German crews were generally well trained and often tactically proficient. Their equipment, vehicle for vehicle, was frequently superior to what they faced. Individual German tank commanders achieved remarkable records, destroying dozens or even hundreds of enemy vehicles. Yet the casualty rates among these crews reached levels that shocked even Wehrmacht leadership accustomed to high losses. The lesson is not that German tanks were poorly designed, though the emphasis on complexity over producibility represented a strategic error. The lesson is not that German crews lacked courage or skill, though training quality declined as the war progressed and experienced crews were killed or captured. The fundamental lesson is about the nature of industrial warfare between modern nations and the ultimate futility of quality when facing overwhelming quantity. Ernst Barkmann survived the war and lived until 2011. In his final interviews, conducted when he was in his 90s, he reflected on his wartime experience with a clarity that came from decades of perspective. He acknowledged his tactical successes, but understood they were meaningless in strategic terms. He had fought skillfully in a losing cause with equipment that was excellent but insufficient. His survival was fortune, not validation of German military superiority. The 83% casualty rate referenced in discussions of German tank crews represents an approximation based on unit records from various formations serving in the West during 1944-45. The precise figure varied by unit, time period, and theatre. Some units experienced lower casualties, others experienced higher, but the overall pattern was consistent. German tank crews died or were wounded at rates that made survival unlikely for anyone serving throughout the final year of the war. These casualties resulted from the fundamental mathematics of attrition warfare. German tanks could achieve favorable kill ratios in individual engagements. A Panther might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but the Allies could replace those losses and continue attacking. German losses were irreplaceable. Each destroyed German tank meant one fewer tank available for future battles. Each killed or wounded crew member could not be easily replaced with someone of equivalent training and experience. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Men who had believed in German superiority faced undeniable evidence that belief was wrong. They had fought skillfully and lost anyway. They had operated superior equipment and been overwhelmed by quantity. They had done everything their training and doctrine prescribed and still experienced catastrophic defeat. This knowledge created a burden that many carried for the rest of their lives. The broader historical lesson extends beyond World War II. The German tank crew experience demonstrates the limits of technological superiority and tactical excellence against opponents with greater industrial capacity. Quality matters in warfare, but quantity has a quality all its own, when the disparity is large enough. Superior equipment and training provide advantages, but they cannot overcome strategic material inferiority of the magnitude Germany faced. For the young tanker standing in his commander's hatch that December morning in 1944, watching 17 Sherman tanks advance across the snow with more visible behind them, the future was already determined. He would fight skillfully. His crew would perform their duties with courage and professionalism. They might destroy several enemy tanks, and it would make no difference whatsoever to the outcome of the battle or the war. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered their individual excellence strategically irrelevant. That was the truth German tank crews learned through bitter experience, paid for with casualty rates that reflected not their failure but the impossibility of their mission. They heard the Shermans before they saw them that morning. By evening, many would be dead. The survivors would face the same scenario again and again until they too became casualties or the war ended. This was not a failure of courage or skill. It was the inevitable result of strategic decisions made years earlier that committed German tank crews to fight a war their nation could not win with equipment, their industry could not produce in sufficient quantities. The casualty statistics simply recorded the human cost of that strategic miscalculation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.